very dry and there's no April showers.
Well, you were just saying, besides it being a virus season, something.
Yeah, the thing that's different about this year in gardening is that you are home. Most of the time, we're so busy, we're not really around that much. And our plants can, we all start with a big burst of enthusiasm, but it's hard to remember that they're kind of more like pets than plants that have been in the ground and established for a long time. And so when we're sowing seeds or getting starts or putting new little plants out, you got to remember to feed them just like you feed the cat or the dog. And they need water pretty much every day in this weather because that little wind actually sucks a lot of moisture out of the soil. So those two things alone, it's a just add water situation right about now.
And that goes for pretty much anything we have?
Well, established plants have deep roots and they're already well down into the ground. They're all right for a while. But you'll notice if you're digging around that it's actually pretty dry already out there. Snowpack is a little over 100% of normal, so that's great. But around here, when you get 2 or 3 weeks without any rain, the soil dries out quite fast. So yeah, any newer plants, transplants, young plants, seedlings, that kind of stuff, definitely be watering all your containers pretty much every day at this point.
And if I were planting in a small space, planting in a patio or a balcony, what kind of things should I be doing right now?
Well, the first thing to think about is how much light do you have? Because that will make a huge difference in the success of your plants. If your balcony or patio or whatever it is north facing, you're going to have to stick with things like greens because things like lettuce, kale, bok choy, that kind of stuff can actually grow pretty well without a whole lot of direct light. But things like beans or peas, tomatoes, they need at least 6 hours a day of real sunlight. If you can't supply that, you're probably better off not trying.
Hi, Madeline.
Hi. Hi, good morning. How are you?
Good. We heard you, so I didn't know if you had a question you wanted to interject here.
Oh, I just came on.
Okay. I'm going to mute you. If you want to talk later, I'll let you just unmute yourself. And if anybody else has a question, they certainly can ask it in the chat box, or they can pop open their microphone and throw it to Ann. So in addition to water, what other things should we be doing to help our plants in this springtime?
Well, again, the first thing you want to look at is what do you have to offer? So you check out your site and say, does this have morning light or afternoon light? Does it have a lot of shade? And the other thing to think about is most of the time you're better off putting things in pots and containers than trying to put them in the ground. Unless you've been gardening a pretty long time, most of the time your soil is truthfully not very good around here. So if you can put things in containers and put good new potting soil in them, you'll have a much better result. And the bigger the container, the better. I use watering troughs, big galvanized tubs that are used for watering horses and things. I don't have horses, but they do actually work great for things like tomatoes and beans and all kinds of vegetables.
So do you use potting soil for the whole watering trough, or how do you put together a mixture for your beans and
When I first I have 3 big troughs, 6 feet long and 3 feet deep. And so the first and I have another bed that I put in too. So I got some soil mix from Tills, which actually is a very good quality vegetable mix. And you're better off with a mix than you are with topsoil, because topsoil is often sort of degraded and it's more like fill. So if you want to put a lot of soil in your raised beds or big containers, you're going to want to go with a vegetable mix, a blend of soils. And again, Tills on the island has a really good one I like a lot. And I've used a couple 100 yards of it in various projects. So I feel like it's pretty consistent as in quality. So once you fill, even stop. Oops. The first thing you do is you put holes in your pots. And in those big troughs, they have a bunghole for water, but you actually have to drill holes in them. Or this is the secret to sustainable gardening. You cause it to be done by others. So if you know someone with a drill, you cause them to drill a whole bunch of holes in the bottom of your big trough. With plastic pots, often the holes are not punched out. So you can get them anywhere, and you bring them home and you stick soil in and they start to fill up with water and you can't figure out what happened. You have to, before you fill them, turn them upside down, take a look. You'll see some, usually they're little circles or squares that are kind of raised. And if you take a flat screwdriver and a hammer and you turn the pot upside down and put it firmly on the ground, put the screwdriver on that circle and whap it with the hammer, and the thing should pop out. Usually it doesn't. It sulkily pokes a little way through. So then you go get your scissors and you cut a bigger hole, because really those holes aren't big enough anyhow. So wreaking havoc is part of the fun. And this time of year, tax season, it's really good to have something you can hit with a hammer.
All right. That also gets out some of the aggression we're feeling right now.
Exactly.
Okay, so I've got my tills mix in either in my pots or in my really big pots.
Right.
And then I'm what am I hunting for? Should I be putting some seedlings in my back window to get them going?
Well, before we even get to that, think about if you don't happen to have a huge trough, maybe you just have a patio, or maybe you just have a little balcony, you can use regular bagged potting soil. I like the EB Stone potting soil. It's a really good quality. There's one called Edna's Favorite, which I like quite a bit. And there's another one called 420, which was developed for growers of foliage plants of a particular psychotropic type. And the 420 mix is really good for things like tomatoes that are gross feeders and really like a lot of nutrients. But most vegetables will do just fine with Edna. But those are really good quality mixes, and I use those in pots and containers in a place where you're not going to be using 1.5 yards. It's just maybe a couple cubic feet of soil. You don't need to order from Tills to do that. But once you get your soil and you get your plants, your containers figured out, if you're living on a deck or patio, you don't necessarily want those containers to sit on the ground. So I usually find some pieces of 2x4 or some rocks or a couple bricks and put them under the container so they get airflow to the bottom. And that helps with drainage, and that keeps them off the ground so you don't get so many slugs and bugs crawling in there and making their nests in the bottoms of the pots.
Great advice.
It's experiential advice.
Everything's been learned the hard way, eh?
Exactly.
So do you want to talk any about seed starting?
Yeah, I do. So it's not too late at all to start seeds. It's been quite cold at night. And when you think about starting seeds, you got to look at your phone, and it usually will tell you the night temperatures as well as day temperatures. And so now we're getting up into the 60s in the day, but it's still dipping into the 30s at night. And it keeps promising to be 40s, but it was 38 this morning. Well, if you're a bean or you're a tomato or a squash, you don't like that. If you're a pea or if you're spinach, you're fine with that. So the cool weather crops are fine. You can sow those outside, and I put them in little pots, and I reuse 4-inch pots or 2-inch pots from past seasons and fill them up with my potting soil and put them in little trays. And indoors, what I use for little trays are these things that you would get meat in at the grocery store. And then you put your little pot in it, and it keeps it from wrecking your bookshelf or your counter or your whatever it is. Ask me how I've learned this one, right? So when you keep those things indoors for a few days or weeks or months, depending on what it is, that was a tomato, and it's not going out till the end of May. But things like peas or spinach or lettuce, you can direct sow out in the garden right now if you want to. I usually start them in pots just because they're small and easily overlooked, and you have a little more control over putting a flat of pots somewhere where you know right where it is. You can keep it watered. And then when they get of a size, which means 2, 3, 4 sets of true leaves, when the seedlings come up, they all have what's called seed leaves, which they don't necessarily look like what they're going to look like when they're grown up. So it's really good idea to make a label for each of your pots. If you haven't done a lot of growing, you can make a label out of something like, this is a cut up piece of Nancy's yogurt tub. And since you can't recycle the tops, I cut the tops in strips and write the names of the things I'm sewing on them. And sometimes I'll put the date as well. And that's a good way.
Oh, your voice went away for some reason. So go down to the bottom of your screen.
There I
maybe.
am. Is that
There
right?
you are. That's perfect.
I don't
So-
know what happened.
Anyway,
What
this
was
is
I?
not, you know about gardening, not webcasting. So
Right.
that's okay.
What was I on about?
Well, you were talking about the strips and labeling each of the things.
Oh, yeah, because here's the deal. When you grow climbing peas and bush peas and you don't label them, when they come up, you have no idea in the world which are which. And you could quite easily put them in the wrong place because the climbers are going to need something to climb on. And if they don't get it, they're just going to sprawl all over the ground and rot. Ask me how I know. So again, this is the kind of thing where you want to make sure you know who's what.
And very easy to use the materials that are at hand. You don't need to go out and buy fancy stuff.
No, the thing that's great about seeds too is seed packets come with directions, and often they're quite specific. So it's one of those things where I know this is difficult and that's not going to be easy for everybody to do. But if you actually read the directions and do what the package tells you, I know, challenging, you actually have a very good chance of having success with your plants.
That's great. Let's talk a little bit about, as I start to see these things pop up, I'm starting to get young plants. What should I be doing outside of just watering them? Anything?
Yeah, again, I don't know if this part got through, but when seeds come up, they have their first set of leaves are called seedling leaves, and they don't look like what they're going to when they grow up. So you want to wait until they have 2 or 3 or even 4 sets of true leaves before you move them to their real position, like put them in a bigger pot. Another reason you don't want to start seeds in a big pot is because for the most part, they don't thrive in big pots. They need a fairly small amount of soil. They do much better in a small amount of soil. In a big pot, little seedling can actually not thrive because it actually it gets too much of everything. I know that's weird, but that's how it goes.
Okay. Again, if people have questions, I'm willing to interrupt this little chat for whatever is on your mind. Carolyn Hart posted in the chat window that she wanted to ask you about angel trumpet, Brugmansia, if it's too dangerous to have around, thinking about grandkids or maybe dogs. So talk a little bit about that.
Okay, so Brugmansia, or angel's trumpet, is a psychotropic plant that's been grown in South and Central America for millennia. It's been used as a shamanistic drug plant because it's a kind of a it's classified as an entheogen, which means you will see God. Now, if you eat it, God will also see you right up close and personal because they're extremely toxic. But there's no if you don't eat them, you're fine. The cool thing about them is that their fragrance is psychotropic too, and it's a mild exhilarant. So you don't need to go to paper and leaf. You can just sit out on the deck. They're night scented because they're pollinated by night flying moths. So they don't really smell much until late afternoon or early evening. And in the night, they're very, very fragrant. And sometimes you'll see big moths, sphinx moths, come and drink nectar from them. But the thing about them is they're not dangerous if you don't eat them, like I said. So my grandkids know they're not supposed to put anything in their mouths. It depends on how old your grandkids are. But if you had them in a really big pot and you could put other pots in front of them, it's extremely unlikely that the kid would wander over there. And many times they're grown as little trees, like a standard. So there's a lot of trunk before you get to a leaf. And if you put it up on a little table or something, the small child wouldn't be able to reach it. Now, I did have an incident when I was overwintering some Brugmansia indoors in my full daylight basement garage at the time. And one of the cats came upstairs and had a huge one eye. The pupil was the size of a dinner plate. And I called the vet and she said, "What are you growing? I know you." And we discovered that she had been playing with the plant, poked her eye on a stick of this plant and got this drug in her eye. And she was seeing God out of one eyeball and my basement out of the other. And she never was the same really after that.
Warning. Okay, well, I guess that answers Carolyn's question.
Oh, well, one thing she might want to know is they're gross feeders, and it's almost impossible to overfeed them.
So, Reed, I have a question.
Yes, Colleen.
Hi, Ann. I miss you.
I miss you.
Thank you for doing this. So my question is about my pots that on my deck that have flowers in them. I always feel I'm over watering. And if I don't let it drip out the bottom, I feel like I'm under watering. How do I know how much water to put in those pots daily?
You're right that you want to make sure the water drips out the bottom, because otherwise what happens is usually you just wet the top few inches and the underside dries. And a lot of times you'll notice they get drier on the edge. And at that point, the water just sheets down the outside of the pot, of the outer walls of the pot, and runs out, and the inner soil doesn't get wet at all. So you do want to make sure. In fact, I usually put big pots in saucers so that they can be standing in water for a little while. And so that way you know that the whole pot is saturated. But what that also means is that now you need to feed them, because continual watering will leach nutrients out of the soil. And plants in the soil have access to a whole lot of nutrients outside of, their roots can travel a long way. In a pot, they're captive. And so we have to be, we're their dietitian. We need to supply those nutrients for them. In containers, I usually use half-strength fertilizers, and I look for balanced fertilizers, like a 5-5-5 balanced organic fertilizer is kind of low, but it's enough of everything and in a good balanced form. And it won't, one of the things that happens when we jump things up with high nitrogen, especially, is plants go to leaf and they don't do much flowering and they don't much do fruiting, right? So if you want fruit and you want flowers, then you want a balanced 5-5-5 is good. You can get a 10-10-10. You can get up to like 20-20-20 or more, but those start to get into the realm of too much of a good thing. Does that make sense? And then you're going to water about every week or two. And you feed, you're going to feed every week or two after you water, because you never want to water a dry plant, because it can burn the roots.
Oh, never want to feed a dry plant.
Yeah, God, I'm sorry.
It's all right. So I'm watering regularly, and then every couple weeks I'm feeding.
Right. And you don't want to use those pelletized fertilizers for a couple reasons. They don't release until the soil temperatures hit the 70s. And there are years where that doesn't actually happen at all. And when they do, like we get those sudden days in May when it's been 40, 50, and it suddenly zooms to 80, all those fertilizer pellets open and dump at the same time, and you often get stunted or burnt plants. So again, avoid pelletized feeds and stick with liquids. And I like to mix a little balanced fertilizer with some liquid seaweed extract, because that actually promotes denser cell growth. The plant leaves will be denser and less susceptible to disease and pests. So liquid seaweed you can get any nursery.
Okay. Does that answer your question, Colleen?
It sure does. Thank you, Ann. That's just, I made notes and I will get out there very soon.
Well, I hope you said feed instead of water when I said water instead of feed.
I knew what you were talking about. Thank you.
Thank you.
And this is Jim Hayner. I was wondering.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I was wondering how, once we've cut back our geraniums and they weathered nicely over the winter, what is the routine then? The daily watering and the fertilizing right away, or do you wait for a while?
Well, if those geraniums overwintered and they're in the same pots they've been in and they're in the same soil they've been in, one thing I usually do is carefully take them out, hose them off a little bit, and put them in fresh soil in a slightly larger pot, because that soil is exhausted and it's just a medium to hold the plant upright at this point. It's not really nutritive anymore. So if you give it some fresh soil and you put it in a slightly larger pot, it will give it everything it needs for the first month or so, and then you can start feeding. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. Thanks very much. I appreciate it.
Sure.
Ann, I thought of something else. This actually isn't a question, and it's just in case people don't know this, that they can go to tilts with their own buckets and just have them pay for it and have them fill their buckets without having to order big amounts.
I don't know if that's still true now. I think that they're just doing. I think that they're just doing direct delivery
Your voice
because we're not supposed to be out interacting with people.
So I went there yesterday because I needed some pea gravel, and I got my 5-gallon buckets, and I just went in. They have a guard at the front, you know, a plastic guard for where you go to pay, and then they have somebody come with a mask and everything over to your area, and they'll fill it for you and put it in your car for you.
Oh, that's awesome, Colleen. That's great. I
Yeah.
didn't realize they were able to do that now. At first, they weren't sure how to handle it. That's great.
Yeah.
Thanks for that breaking news. That will give us all a lot more options. So, what vegetables work best here if I wanted to plant a little vegetable garden? And
The easiest things to do are greens. So lettuce, spinach, kale, chard, that kind of stuff, bok choy, all the Asian choys, mustard greens. Those are really easy and they don't need a whole lot of direct light. So as little as 3 or 4 hours of direct sunlight, morning light, and they'll be just fine. And they usually are quite quick crops too. And so you can get through a batch of lettuce in a couple months. And so we always want to sow a few pots of babies and have them in the wings waiting to pot up. Because as you use up those crops, you want to replenish the soil, freshen it up a little bit, and then plant out your next batch of seedlings so they can be sizing up while you're eating off the first batch. So lettuce and greens and that kind of stuff, which are going to maybe be in short supply, sounds like possibly. Those are really good crops for us all to be able to grow, and they do great in containers on a balcony or terrace or patio or anything like that. You don't need acres wide. In fact, you can do them in a window box if you want to. Another thing I would do in window boxes is hardy herbs, because nothing freshens up food like a little pinch of this or that. It's early to do basil. It's still too cold at night. But rosemary, sage, thyme, oregano, those are really easy to grow and they will do great in containers. And they can be inside for a while and then you can put them out into the garden, and they're perennial. So they'll grow on for years and years. But those are the best starter plants.
in late May, like tomato time?
Yes, exactly. Because tropical plants they don't like night temperatures that are lower than the 50s, because night temperatures affect soil temperatures. And so if the soil is in the 40s, they are not going to do well. It can actually check their growth, stunt their growth. So you want to wait. And that's why Memorial Day is kind of the traditional plant out.
Okay. Well,
Oops.
we may have lost Ann there.
Are you back, Ann?
And come back.